Let's take a look at some Java provided classes. We're going to look at the wrapper classes that are associated with the primitive types. Here we have all the primitive types on the left, byte all the way through Boolean, and then on the right hand side we have the associated wrapper classes that go with these. Once we get into ArrayList, this will make a lot more sense. The context there for the wrapper classes is much more useful than what we're doing here, but this is just an intro so you got a general idea how these things work and that they exist. I can make integers with the primitive type int, and I can also make an integer with the wrapper class called integer with a capital I. I can, go back and forth between instantiating integer objects and assigning it primitive values. It does the same thing. If you say num1 equals 99, it's the equivalent of saying num1 equals new integer 99. And that'll make a whole lot more sense later, but just understand that you can mix and match the primitives with the wrapper types. That's perfectly okay to do that. And here we're just doing the same thing as we did with integers with doubles. And here I'm throwing some examples in there for you to give you some context where I'm making some integers. I'm pulling the primitive value out. It does that naturally. You don't have to do num.int value to get the 3 out of num. But anyway, these are some methods that do exist, and this is the way that you can instantiate objects with the wrapper types and then pull values back and forth. Once again, once we get to ArrayList, this will make a whole lot more sense. Here, this is an intro to compare to. I'm going to leave this one for you to look it up. When we get into strings in the next unit, the next video, we're going to talk way more about compare to. But compare to enables you to compare one object to another. If you're just dealing with primitives, you don't need to do compare to. You can do greater than and less than, which we'll be looking at as we move forward. So anyway, when you wrap a primitive, it's called boxing, and whenever you unwrap it, it's called unboxing. Like I said, this is going to make a whole lot more sense when we get to an ArrayList. All right, let's take a look at an example real quick. Okay, let's take a look at some code where we're actually manipulating the wrapper classes in terms of primitives and going back and forth between the primitives and the wrappers. So here I have double with a capital D, dub equals 9.3. And then I say dub, take your 9.3, copy it over to the primitive. You can go back and forth. It doesn't change a thing. I can come in here if I want, and I can say new double. I can instantiate the double wrapper object. I can point dub at it. I can then pull the value out and put it over into my primitive without any trouble whatsoever. I could also come in here and say double value to force it to unbox it and pull the primitive out, but it doesn't change anything. So honestly, when you're working with these, you do not need to do any of the instantiation. You can just put it back to normal, and then you can just come back in here and just tell the wrapper to give you the primitive value, and it's perfectly happy doing that. Probably won't hurt you to know that you can instantiate the wrapper classes and that you can call the methods to pull the primitives out, but it does that automatically. It auto unboxes and auto boxes for you so that you don't have to call those constructors, and you don't have to pull the values out of the objects with some kind of method that retrieves the primitive, but you could. And then at the bottom, compare to compares one object to another. If the first reference is bigger than the second value, it returns a positive number. If the first reference is smaller than the second value, it returns a negative number. And if they're exactly the same, it returns 0. So 12 compared to 12 is 0, 12 compared to 17 is -1, and then 12 compared to 10 is 1. So your job before we get into strings is to go spend some time, look up compare to, mess around with it, and make sure that you understand how it works. This is just an intro. We'll spend a whole lot more time with it as we move forward. Okay, as we wrap up, we talked about object instantiation. We did a little review there. We talked about instance variables. We talked about constructors, mutators, accessors, and then we talked a little bit about auto boxing. So at this point, you should have the knowledge that you need to take what we did with introducing methods to now ramp it up and build full-blown classes and make runners. So it's important that you go out and play with the examples and mess around with that code to make sure that you totally understand how the pieces are put together. And what you got to do is you got to steadily and all the time crank code. The more code you write, the better you get at this. There's no substitute for practice and for just writing lots of code. Plus, it's fun. It's a lot of fun to write code.